Alright, so today we're going to take a look at this and we're going to try to get some type of user input. Specifically, some type of control where we can move a viewport. Hold on. Well, I said I was going to do all this in one take, so I guess I should just keep on rolling. I was thinking about it, and before we render these pixels as tiles, it would probably be best to have some way to move around the world first. When you make a game, the very last thing you do is, add the polish. When you're prototyping something, and you need like some NPCs and you need a player character or whatever, usually all you really need is like, oh, well, the NPCs can be blue squares and the character can be a red square. You don't really need to worry about like animation and art assets and whatnot when you're first trying to figure things out. So we really shouldn't worry about rendering the pixels as tiles just yet, because that's more of like a polish aspect, or it's more polished than the rough mechanics. We want to get into this before we go down that route of getting into more of the details, if that makes sense. Now, that's a very highly subjective thing of, what is more polish and what is more like general mechanics, and like where should you code next. There's no really right or wrong answer for that. For what's the next thing you need to code, right? You just need to figure out your own way of, okay, how do I organically build on top of my code base and grow it, right? Because you always want your code to be working somehow, and you always want to get to that next checkpoint of, all right, I got this new feature in the code and it's working and I can test it and use it. And sometimes you might have like this huge feature you want, and it's like, okay, it's going to take like a week to code. A week is way too long to not have anything tangible to like be able to work with and see. So you'll have to like figure out, okay, well, how do I take that big thing, chop it up into a whole bunch of little checkpoints that each have their own like results that I can see and verify. Okay, anyways, so I've kind of ranted. But the next thing we're gonna do here, as last time, where we took the code, copied it, pasted it, and used it as something to work off of, we're gonna keep on doing that for a while until this code gets to be, well, we need like at least 1,000 lines before I'm going to even consider chopping it up into smaller files. So I'm thinking that I want some way to move viewport 1 being the off-screen viewport. I want to somehow move that viewport around so that it has the result of a camera that's moving around the world. I specifically want this viewport to have the ability to move in snapping increments. I have a very specific reason for why I want to do that. I'm not really going to get into why I want to do it that way, but I have an example of why you might want to do it that way. Let's say you have a very large world and you want to use subsections of that world as like different rooms in a game. So maybe, and all the rooms are the same size. So maybe you need some type of way to have a camera mechanism that can like snap to grid subsections of your world map. And that's kind of what I'm going to do. And I'm going to use each subsection of the world map to store different things. And I may actually start off using this world map camera kind of code as a tile editor. Also, I would recommend that if you can, Instead of having a separate tile editor and then a separate like game engine and world viewer, I would really advise that you make both of those code bases the exact same code, and then you just have like an editor mode that you can switch on and off. That way you only have one code base that you have to maintain, and you don't have to be like, okay, we got this working. Okay, how do we get it to work in the editor? You don't have to worry about that, because the editor and the world and the game, right, they're all the same code, right? And it's just like when their game is running, you just turn the ability to edit the world off. I believe some of like idTech's engine does that. I saw a talk where like John Carmack was showing their ability to like edit levels in real time. Anyways, I've been ranting. The next thing we're going to do is we need some type of input device, because I want it to where when we press the keyboard, we can change where the viewport 1, the off-screen viewport, or we can change where that is snapped onto the off-screen data that it's viewing. I'm going to make a class called a input adapter, and then that input adapter is going to feed commands into some type of mechanism that moves around the camera viewport. And I very specifically want a input adapter because the logic for getting click events and mouse events onto this canvas is very platform-specific code. And by platform-specific, I mean it's specific to JavaScript, which I guess isn't really what people mean when they say platform-specific. But the idea is, if I ever want to take this code and move it over to some other language, I want to make sure that I have isolated the pieces of code that are very specific to a certain language. And so that's kind of like why with the canvas, I have a thing called a canvas adapter, because HTML5 canvas, that's very specific to JavaScript, and it's also very specific to a canvas kind of workflow. And the workflow for doing this in OpenGL would be a little bit different, right? Because in OpenGL you redraw the screen every single frame. So when you encapsulate, you wanna have a reason for encapsulating, right? You don't just want to like wrap every single class you write with getters and setters, because now you just have all this junk code that doesn't serve any purpose. I would also recommend that don't encapsulate things because you're just afraid that the user of the code, some other programmer, is going to use a variable wrong, right? Oh, this variable is supposed to be read-only, so we better wrap it in a getter and setter. How about no? How about you don't do that? How about you write your code base correctly? How about you communicate with your team members, you know? How about you have tests in your code to check for, you know, bugs and whatnot, but to like specifically wrap your code in getters and setters so that another programmer doesn't use it incorrectly, like, what the hell is that? That's just going to be boilerplate code all over the place, more clutter. It's not going to be as performant. Just don't do that. Have a better reason for encapsulating your data. For example, with the Canvas adapter, the actual logic of how you interface with the data and put pixels into that data is going to vary depending on, you know, where we move this code from. So it definitely needs to be encapsulated so that I have a way to easily strip out code that I've been writing and move it over to some C code I've been writing, right? Like, have a reason for why you're encapsulating things. A lot of times people are going to encapsulate because they're uncertain if the implementation is going to change, like the underhood implementation. And I get why you would do that. And a lot of times in business code, you encapsulate every single thing because you just can't afford to risk it, right? Because that business code needs to be running 24/7. You can't just, I don't know, maybe your business code is like keeping up some type of vital system, healthcare system or something that just absolutely can't go down no matter what. And so you have to write, if you're doing that kind of code, where it's like business code, you're kind of forced to write your code in a very clunky kind of way and encapsulate things that you really shouldn't be encapsulating just because you cannot afford risking needing to change something and having hard-coded it a certain way. But we're not writing enterprise software. We're writing game code, and so we can afford, and we should, play it a little bit more dangerously, if you will. What else do I have to say on this since I'm ranting? So if you haven't written code like this before, figuring out, well, what things should be encapsulated, what things shouldn't be encapsulated, how are you going to figure that out? And the answer is, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're just going to fuck it up. Sometimes you just got to, like, write 1, 2, 3 different code bases, and you're going to keep on fucking it up, but each iteration, you're going to have a better feel of how things need to be done. A lot of times we get this attitude that because this is code and we can refactor things, that we think of code as much more fluid than it is. And while we can change things around and while it is digital, I would say that it's dangerous to think of code as completely fluid and completely refactorable and just this thing that you can make do whatever you want. It would be helpful, I think, for people to think of code as more like making a building, right? And with a building, you could add an addition to it, and you can make some modifications. You can break down some walls, right? And you can make changes to it. And those changes would be analogous to like refactoring code, but it's not like a completely simple thing. It's not like a trivial undertaking. And once we've kind of set the initial structure of how the program's supposed to work, we're gonna entrench ourselves deeper and deeper into like structures that just cannot be changed, right? Like that foundation, right? You can remodel the house, but how hard would it be to like dig up the foundation and redo the foundation? So think of code as, it's digital, yes, but a lot of it is a lot less flexible than you realize. And sometimes when you want to fix something, you might just have to burn it all down and just try it again. And some people will be like, no, don't throw away your code, because if you keep on throwing away code, you'll never make anything because you'll keep on throwing it away. And you know what? There's truth to that. But also, if you ever hear the pottery analogy where, one group of students, they work on pottery and they're graded just on the quantity of pottery they produce. They produce like a new pot like every day. And then there was another group that they worked on pottery and they only had to make one piece for the whole semester, and they were only graded on the quality of that one piece. And it turns out that the group that had to make a whole bunch of pottery had better quality pottery than the people that only had to make one piece of pottery and just make it perfect. And the moral of the story is that, practice makes perfect, right? And so the learning process is very iterative, right? We're going to code some stuff, and we're going to dig ourselves into some type of hole that we're just not going to be able to get ourselves out of, and then we'll have to, like, code everything over again, right? Or maybe we don't code everything over again, but we start with a fresh code base, and then we just go through, like, some old code snippets, some old classes, and we're like, okay, this is nice. take that, strip that out of the project, reuse that code. And yes, I am saying reuse as in cut and paste and collage stuff together. And usually when people say code reuse, they just mean, oh, have a function that you can reuse in your current code base. And I'm saying sometimes you just want to take some good code and cut it out of a project that you've decided to abandon and use that as a foundation to work on another code base. I'm going to stop recording now because I think I've done a lot of ranting, and it just makes sense to me to, since now I want to get coding, it just makes sense to me to have it in a next video so that it's easier for you to just ignore this entire video if you want, because I didn't show you any code. So I will see you in the next video.